And we're live. It is Monday, May 11th, 2020, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 a.m. time in Brisbane, Australia, which is relevant to our current show for reasons that will momentarily become apparent. Boris Johnson says, quote, I hope for a vaccine, but it is, quote, by no means guaranteed. We have no Kim Jong-un news for you, but Kate has an important Murder Hornets update.
Is this the one Murder Hornet update that you gave me?
Duh.
Okay, the Murder Hornet update is that that the LA Times and the New York Post are both reporting that panic over murder hornets might lead to the murder of bees, which is exactly what murder hornets do.
Right. So
yes, murder hornets literally don't murder humans, or they can.
Might be at risk because we're panicking over murder hornets. In good murder hornet news, however, WBAL in Baltimore is reporting that it, quote, might be years before the murder hornets reach Maryland. So for all of you Maryland residents, you got years to go. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. The murder hornets are creeping their way across toward Maryland, and we're killing bees in the meantime. Everything sucks. But in lieu of fun, we have an incredible conversation for you today on the Facebook Oversight board, about which I know so vanishingly little compared to Kate that I'm just going to shut up and let her introduce our guests and describe the run of show for today.
When Ben asked me to do this show, like without any warning, he just cold called me on Twitter and was like, I want to do this show with you. Will you do it? And I bet he never knew that we would have like roughly like 1/3 of all of our shows would be about the Oversight board.
You know, I knew it was an obsession of yours, but like did not propose, Kate, that we do this show if I wanted to do a show that was entirely about my singular fixations and areas of interest, I would have done it by myself.
That's true.
And if I'd wanted to do it only with somebody who is interested in the same things that I am, I would have asked, Quinta Jurecic or Susan Hennessy. The idea was to diversify. And so this is an area where Kate knows about as much as anybody else in the world, including she can just say, hey, let's have a Meet the Oversight Board episode. And she calls up a bunch of members of the Oversight Board, and here they are. So Kate, who do we have?
I'm so happy to introduce. I'm going to start with Jamal. Jamal Green is a professor of law at Columbia, and he is a scholar on free expression and the First Amendment, and he is a chair of the Oversight Board. Nick Suzer is calling in from what city are you in?
Brisbane, Australia.
Brisbane. Calling
Hence
from Brisbane.
The earlier reference to Brisbane, Australia time.
Oh yeah, sorry.
See what I did there, Kate?
I did see what you did there. Oh my God. Ben, I can't pay attention to things you're saying and prepare for bios at the same time.
Can't pay attention to things I'm saying. It's true. It's like no one should.
Nick is a professor at Queensland Tech and also on the Oversight Board. He is a scholar of content moderation. He has a wonderful book called Lawless, which is all about internet governance. And it's one of my favorite books on the subject. And then John Samples is vice president of the Cato Institute and is also working on a book about tech companies and their influence on democracy. And he is also a member of the Oversight Board. So thanks for coming on, guys. And it's just that short notice. We do not have to spend this entire time talking about the Oversight Board. It's just it's just fun to have all of you together. And I like all of you separately. Even if you hadn't been named to the Oversight Board, I would have invited you on the show, just FYI. So yeah, I guess I'll start off with just kind of asking how you felt about the reaction to the announcement last week, how you how you feel like it went. You're in different places, hearing different things. Yeah.
So I'll jump in. I think the announcement has gone pretty well from our perspective. There's been a lot of, I think, pretty positive coverage about the members of the board, and I'm pretty proud of the members, including the ones who are on this call. We've got a lot of thoughtful people, a pretty good diversity of views. I think there's been some what I'd call kind of constructive criticism about the kind of scope of the board and what it can actually accomplish, and those are kind of the same kinds of questions that we all have about this thing, right? It's something that hasn't existed before now, and we're sort of there at the beginning and trying to build something. So there's going to be challenges, and we're all aware of that. But I think most of the coverage I've seen has been, pretty accurate and pretty fair.
You guys think the same?
I would agree with that. I'll just jump in. I mean, going into this, you never can tell with something like this how the reaction is going to be. And so I think it's been, I would say, people are willing to give it a chance. I think that's because the view was widespread that we didn't necessarily know was widespread, which is people have some sense that the status quo is not stable, that you can't go on the way you are. And yet the alternatives down the line are probably worse than this. So this really needs to be given a chance. And I think that that came through. I do hope, I mean, thinking about this, I've noticed these things like there's the board, and I really wanted to see it work, but there's also these things you have to do as a person. And so someone was telling me last week, I was complaining about something, or somebody said, and he said, I have one great advantage over you and in these matters, and it's pay no attention. I pay no attention to these things. And I think that's my aspiration, to pay no attention to the stuff that's superfluous and irrelevant, and to pay attention to the people that have constructively critical things to say. That's going to be my goal as a good scout going down the line.
So I'd like to ask you each to describe how you came to be on the Facebook Oversight Board. Was it something you applied for? Was there a past set of interactions with Facebook? What were the, it's a little bit like, I understand how somebody, gets on the Supreme Court, but now there's the sort of famously dubbed the Supreme Court of Facebook, and the process by which you all ended up on it is not entirely obvious to me. I mean, it's, and so if you could each, start with Nicholas, but how did it happen? Like, what's the, did you just get a phone call one day, or maybe a Facebook direct message, or a messenger message? Like, how did it happen?
I think they have AI for that these days. No, so it's been a long journey for me. I've been working in this area for about a dozen years since my PhD, and sort of.
And what area? When you say that, is that content moderation? Yeah. Is it?
I've kind of been shouting at people or groups like Facebook and other social media platforms about legitimacy. Essentially, all of my work over the last decade has been making the core point that these social media companies and tech platforms have a huge amount of power over our lives. For a long time, right, this is a sentiment that's been building, and I think there was an interesting turning point a few years ago when Facebook really felt the sort of pressure to change the way that they were doing things. And so over the last couple of years, I've been doing a little bit of consultation on and off with Facebook about trying to actually improve their processes. So just on content policy, or in particular with this, we had a couple of sessions with them on the Oversight board. Kate obviously was there as well, and where we provided feedback on the structure to make sure that it was independent and had the bylaws and the charter were as strong as they could be. So I had some existing relationship with those teams, and then I applied for a web portal, and the rest I probably have to ask Jamal for more insight here. But as I understand it, the chairs were largely responsible for that selection process, and I interviewed with one of the other chairs, and here I am.
John and Jamal, how did you end up involved?
Well, a similar situation, except similar in a lot of ways. Like I've been working in the area. I've been working in free speech for 20 years or so, but in this particular area, a much shorter time than Nick. But I think he may have gotten there first, but at some point it occurred to me that legitimacy was the issue here. They were clearly going to try to do content moderation, and they had to figure out how it could become legitimate. And I had this view that it was, again, the best alternative going forward, at least for the time being. It may turn out that other possibilities exist and are better. I don't know, but we got to find that out. So that all interested me, and it interested me that the future of free speech in many ways was here rather than in DC, which is why I'm sitting here in Menlo Park now. So there was all of that. And then I frankly thought that I guess I said to someone, I don't remember, that I was interested in this, but I didn't hear anything for a long time. And so I thought actually that it was going on somewhere else and someone else had been selected. So I was quite surprised when this whole process started. The process Nick describes is correct. And so it went on, but when I got the first phone call, I had long ago given up that there was going to be any kind of chance for me, actually. So yeah, I think it's interesting to me that we both sort of came toward the legitimacy question from different points of view, actually. There's other questions that are important, but that's a kind of core one, I think.
And I think one doesn't always know how you get the attention of Facebook. I didn't apply for the position in any way. I was aware of the idea from just some of my own work in constitutional law and some of my own work I worked at the Knight First Amendment Institute for a year with Jamil Jaffer. But I first heard from them, and there was a whole process, or there was a public process of people submitting names. There were a bunch of workshops that Facebook engaged in. There were lots of stakeholders that they consulted with. And then as the co-chairs got involved, they did some of that interviewing and selection as well. And, I think I probably got to people's attention, maybe from some of my academic work. I've written a lot about how you deal with conflicts of rights. How do you deal with situations in which you've got to balance a bunch of different values and you've got a bunch of different stakeholders? What kinds of decision processes should you use? And I've done that in a way that's sort of critical of the way Americans think about rights typically. So that probably got some people's attention. I got a phone call or an email in October, and then I joined the board about a month or two ago as a co-chair, and joining the other three co-chairs at that stage.
Gotcha.
Yeah, no, so we have a question from Michael Waxenberg that I think is kind of great. I went down a giant rabbit hole of trying to understand legitimacy, and I think in August and September when I was working on this paper, because I was simultaneously trying to write it while watching the process of building it unfold, which, by the way, I would never recommend to anyone. It's very, very difficult to kind of have perspective on something. And I feel like things are only finally gelling in the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months. But I went down this huge rabbit hole in legitimacy, and I remember Nate Persley, who's been on the show, and you guys, I think all of you pretty much know, Nate said something after one of the workshops that Facebook held, that he kind of like closed the meeting basically with this great comment of just like, listen, it took the Supreme Court of the United States 20 years to get legitimacy. Like, it wasn't always legitimate. It's this thing that kind of happens over time. And, there's no like precise formula for it. And so you just really kind of have to wait and see. And I think it's, and to that extent, I think that kind of is a great lead into like Michael's question. Michael, do you want to go ahead and ask?
Thanks, Kate. I don't know if I can live up to that preamble. Great panel as always. I was just wondering, since legitimacy is a goal I think we can all endorse, I was wondering how each of you individually kind of define that term and how you'll measure your success toward achieving it, and whether the board has tackled that question together yet.
So I can start with the second question is easy. No, we haven't defined it together. We haven't met together very much, and that's part of what we're going to be doing a lot of over the summer virtually. The process has been slowed down quite a bit by coronavirus issues. And my answer to the first question, sort of how do you define legitimacy? It's a great question. And I'm inclined to answer it the way, a famous Supreme Court justice answered it, which is you know it when you see it. If we get to a place,
yeah, he was describing legitimacy, right?
Right, he was talking exactly about legitimacy of a sort. I think if 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 or 5 years from now, let's say, if it's obvious that this board should still exist, then that's probably a good thing in terms of its success. I think if it's made a bunch of decisions that Facebook disagrees with, but that were implemented and led to constructive conversation about the limits of free expression, or how far it should go, that means that we've been successful. I think the board's trying to be transparent. It's trying to be a body that gives reasons for things and doesn't just spit out decisions. And so, are people reading our decisions? Is it leading to real engagement about some difficult questions? That's the measure of success. I don't know that I could be any more specific than that. If we're doing our job, and if Facebook is also living up to its own commitments, which I'm optimistic about, but who knows what the future holds, then that'll be, I will consider it a job well done.
So I think this is such a great question, and to echo some of Jamal's points here, what I think the reason I think it's a great question is because it highlights the sort of different understandings of legitimacy that are out there. And so, I think of legitimacy in sort of two main ways. The first being normative legitimacy, what we kind of think we ought to expect in a more theoretical sense, and empirical legitimacy, which is, do people actually, as a social fact, accept that a body like Facebook has a right to exercise its power in the way that they do? And that sort of division, I'm not terribly concerned in this role with Facebook's side of that problem. I think that the reason that Facebook has been pressured to improve its processes is that it is losing legitimacy, and it has been under sustained attack for quite a long time, to the point where it has been forced to take on some measures to improve the way that it does things. So you might think that there could be a measure of whether Facebook is arbitrating or enforcing its rules in a way that is more accepted to the people who are affected. I'm less concerned with that bit than I am with the normative side that I think about in two main ways. The procedural aspect of legitimacy. Historically, when we talk about what it means to govern in a legitimate way, there's been a component of due process or of rule of law or some of these values that mean that the rules have to be transparent. They have to be applied in a fair way. They have to be knowable in advance. They have to be there has to be a good route for appeal, and hopefully the people should feel like they are heard and governed in a fair way procedurally. But there's also a really important substantive content to that, which is much, much harder, and that's where the rules should reflect some justifiable vision of the common good. And I think that where we've landed here as an oversight board is probably the best we can do on that substantive, thicker part of legitimacy, which is we do have international human rights, and they're the yardstick for where we start to measure the substantive value of the rules that Facebook are applying. And so those two concerns are what I'm hoping to achieve. How do we actually measure success? I don't think that there is an end state of success. I don't think that this is a binary question where we can say that we have now achieved legitimacy. This is going to be an incredibly hard thing to do, and our job here, as I see it, is really to pressure Facebook to do better on all of these measures. And see, I have a more incremental view of success. If we're in a better position than we were previously on these two points, then I think that we've done a good job, but I always think there's going to be room for improvement and ongoing work.
So on the question of legitimacy, I think we will find it as we go along. And I agree with Nick's distinctions. I guess I would add more along the lines. I come from, when I was working on this, I did a lot of stuff about Max Weber at one time. And so I sort of slapped myself in the head that we were back to Weber again, right? And one of Weber's ideas about legitimacy, and his is largely an empirical conception, is about rational legal legitimacy and rational legal authority, which is the procedural element, the rule of law. This is the thing, actually, we should mention, since our host is here, that Kate got to this quite early. At the end of The New Governors is really talking about, in some of our other papers, is talking about the need for process, right, and how you inject process. And so we circle back to that quite a bit. But I do think the empirical part, which is the idea that, you'll exercise a kind of authority, and people may not like the results, but they'll accept it, right? They'll accept the board, they'll accept the process. And how do you get there? That's an empirical outcome, ultimately. And if we can't do that, if we can't reach that acceptance generally speaking, among users, then we're going to have to look for something else, right? On the normative side, I have a lot of those same interests, although I'm probably more from a kind of a liberal individualist point of view. I'm toying with the idea that if you look at what's being done in content moderation, it does seem like not only Facebook, but a lot of the companies are working with something like a harm principle. And of course, you pull the harm principle up and everyone thinks John Stuart Mill. And in fact, of course, that was his idea. The question is, that was one essay with one sort of conception, and it's something to build on. It's not something that you apply. You just don't pull it out of On Liberty and apply it. But it's, I think, a flexible idea that we're going to try to fill out. And I think it's a workable one, because the other side of the legitimacy element that I personally keep forgetting, and maybe others don't, is I grew up in the United States. All my work has been about the United States, et cetera. This board is not just about the United States, right? Some portion of the users of Facebook certainly are from the United States, but far greater numbers aren't. And so these ideas, these normative ideas, have to be persuasive to a broader set of people beyond one culture, one nation, one group of people, actually. And that's sort of And I have a hypothesis that the harm principle can do that for us. But I don't know that that's true. And if it can't, I'll change my mind down the line.
I just want to say that I'm super disappointed that none of you said you were going to use your positions on the oversight board to just silence your enemies. But it's not too late.
Somebody should have said, I am here to punish enemies and advantage friends. And because that is my conception of justice.
To smite them from Facebook and yours.
Exactly.
Yeah, like, I'm going to go to David's question, but in the interest of doing something a little bit not the oversight board, I'll make fun of myself. And you referencing Weber, I cannot hear about like Max Weber's name and not think about my first year in the PhD program at Yale when I was in a seminar with some very, 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 very smart people. And I felt like kind of a hayseed and, was like doing all the stuff, doing all the reading, thought I was doing fine. And my professors just kept people kept mentioning like Weber. And I was just like, wow, did we read Weber? Like, I didn't read Weber. Like, who is this Weber guy? And, went home, Googled, could not find Weber, could not find it. I was spelling it V-A-B-E-R. And I actually wrote an email to my colleagues. Like, I only had 2 other people in my PhD cohort. I've never wanted to drop out of a program so much as when I got their reply back. But they were like, I was like, hey, who's this Weber guy? Is he at Yale? Is he just like a thing at Yale? Like, is he just like something? And then literally I sent the email and it was like, click, click, click. I was like, oh my God. It's Max Weber. There is, yeah. Anyways, It just finally clicked. I just was like, it was pretty embarrassing.
It's Luke's father, right?
What do you say? Yeah.
We all have things
closely related.
Yeah. Things we believed long after we were old enough to know better. David Clinch, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me. I'm sorry about the incidental noise. I'm walking my dog in a forest while I'm listening to you.
That
sounds
is
nice.
What everyone should be doing.
Yeah, so just a very quick question, and it's a bit rhetorical, but nevertheless. What level of expertise do you consider the Oversight Board members to have at this moment in relation to how information and specifically mis and disinformation happen and spread on all of the Facebook platforms? And what, if any, steps do you have planned to prepare yourselves, the board, to address that issue in terms of obviously not a broad knowledge, but a specific expertise level knowledge?
So that's a really interesting question. And let me broaden it a little bit, actually, because I'd be interested to just as a general matter in what sort of training that you guys are going to be given. Is this a situation where tomorrow you start getting cases, or is there a sort of end-to-end learning Facebook system that goes with it? So just, address David's question specifically about disinformation, but also, what's the training regimen going to look like?
So I can certainly speak to the training regimen, which I think is partly also relevant to David's first question, which is, no, we're not hearing cases right away. That I think won't happen for at least a few months, and part of the reason for that is for training purposes. There are elements of training that we would be able to go through more efficiently if we were able to meet in person and have a few days of seminars together, but nobody can do that on Zoom, and so it ends up being strung out for a longer period of time. And there is a kind of step-by-step learning process that we're all going to be going through, involving Facebook and Instagram's platforms, their interface, how Facebook thinks about content moderation, how it thinks about human rights, those kinds of questions before we get into mock cases in which we will also receive lots of information and talk to each other as well about dealing with the various buckets that the board's going to be dealing with. I'll say just in general that the board members are and Nick and John can speak to this a little bit from their own particular perspectives, but the board members were chosen along a number of different measures of diversity. Some of those measures have to do with particular knowledge and depth of knowledge of social media, but there's also expertise in human rights. There's also expertise in journalism. There's also expertise in law, and
institution building.
Yeah, exactly. One of my co-chairs is a politician, among other things. So there's a range of expertise on the board, but we're not relying on the board itself to generate all of the substantive knowledge that you have to generate to solve these cases. We have a staff, an administrative staff, that will be doing a lot of providing, and they'll contract with others to provide substantive knowledge in particular areas. In a global company, even if we did have some knowledge about disinformation and misinformation, we would still need to supplement that quite a bit from the outside, and that's going to be part of what we do.
I think that's a really interesting point. Sorry, Ben.
No, go ahead.
Just to quickly jump in there, because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, right? For a number of years now, which is we're never going to be able to be experts on everything that is brought before us. And some of us have some experience in various matters, but the core issue, I think, for us to work out over the next few months is how we're going to work out what we don't know and bring in that expertise into the decision-making process. I think it's going, and it's not just, even if you look at something like disinformation, misinformation, there are so many regional and culturally specific aspects of that it's going to be incredibly difficult for any one person to be across everything that they need to know, and then to be able to be effective as a member of a team with people who do not have that sort of very deep expertise as a scholar specific on misinformation might have. And so I see this as a big challenge, and Siva-Vaidhyanathan's written a little bit about this over the last week or so, and I take that seriously, that criticism and concern, because I do think that we are going to be faced with these types of problems very quickly. So I think what I'm really interested in here is, Jamal's already mentioned this, the sort of expertise that we'll be able to draw on within the board, but I think that there's going to be a lot of work that we need to do to draw in better context as we hear decisions, to make sure that we are aware of the particular issues that people are actually facing. I think that's something that if we that we'll never be perfect at, but if we are mindful about, we can try to draw in the expertise that we need as we go to inform the decisions.
All right, so I want to be a nudnik here and just pose the question of Facebook's motivations, because we had Noah Feldman on talking about the sort of origins of the board, and his account of it was like plausible on its face. And yet I have this reaction that companies do not set up, boards to oversee themselves and reduce their flexibility to deliver value to their shareholders without some very good and specific reason. And I find it a little bit hard to believe that the reason could be anything as diffuse and gauzy as legitimacy. And so I want to ask you all, what does Facebook get out of this? Is this deferral of regulation? Is this fear of being kind of banned in places? Is it fear of being disliked? What is Facebook maximizing by doing this that is tangible value to its shareholders, and particularly its majority shareholder?
So I'll take a swing at this. I think if you think over the long term, and one of the first things when I first talked to Facebook employees was they told me about Mark Zuckerberg, that when you see him, he generally talks about 5 years into the future about where the company is going to be. So if you think over a longer term and you look at the status quo, you might really believe that this isn't sustainable. And so if we just keep doing what we've been doing, in fact, we're going to fall pretty far below that bringing value to our shareholders. And so we've got to look at some practical solutions to it. And then they put in substantial support for this. They thought a lot and brought a lot of talent to bear on this issue to try to create some independence. It's the other element that beyond legitimacy, and the people at Facebook or the Oversight Board that I've met don't talk about legitimacy all that much. They talk about independence and having someone outside of Facebook help make these decisions. So I guess the sort of hard-nosed idea that I would say is, I think you can see this as a good business decision down the line if it works, because the alternatives are really actually going to be much lower from the shareholders' point of view. Now, that having been said, I have to say, having lived 20 years where Ben is right now, Washington, D.C., I was struck when I came out here and started meeting with the people that talked about all this stuff. Having been in DC 20 years, all of the idealism, I didn't think idealism existed anymore, right? These people working on this board, I don't know, I can't speak for the upper levels of the company, but the people working on the board were very idealistic, and they thought they were doing something that could really make the world better. And I found that really refreshing, actually, and I hadn't seen it for a while. So that may be me and not DC. I'm open to that. But I'm also not sure that this was a business decision completely so, but I can see how it could be, because I think that's actually the justification I gave, I think is actually true, right? If things just go on as they are, you're not going to be, it's not a good business decision. It's not best for the shareholders in the longer run.
Jamal, what do you think?
Well, I just wanted to amplify it, because I think that's a really, the last bit of what John said, I think is really important, is I can't get inside of Mark Zuckerberg's head. I could make guesses about what his particular motivations are and how they relate to regulation and so forth, but they'd be pretty bad guesses from my perspective. It's not something I've particularly studied, but the nature of an organization, or Facebook is a they, not an it, right? It's the nature of an organization. The leadership, assigns people a task, and the people who've been building this out have, in my experience, been extremely serious people who really want this to work, regardless of whatever someone's initial motivation might have been. It's got its own life now, and now that the board is up and running, the members are significantly responsible for its success, and there are a number of safeguards of its independence, such that it, at some level, it doesn't really matter what the initial subjective motivation might have been. We're here, and again, I think the people on the Facebook side who've been tasked with this have taken it extremely seriously, at least in my experience as a co-chair.
I've been thinking about this in terms of constitutionalization, right? If you look at the history of how we impose limits on governing power, you're right. We would never expect a company to just decide to limit its power. We don't expect a government to decide spontaneously for the good of its people to limit its power. These things only come about as a response to intense external pressure and sustained external pressure from all fronts. So we've seen that pressure exercised on Facebook over the last decade from its advertisers who are sick of the lack of reliability and are concerned about the substantive content of policies. We've seen it from regulators, we've seen it from user base, we've seen it from all over. And it's that pressure that forces a change in how organizations constitute themselves, how they try to respond. And I think that's the opportunity. So it's out of that pressure that we are born and have this opportunity to keep going. But it's something that we have to keep up. It's something that everyone who cares about how our online social spaces are governed have to keep up in order to ensure that the responses align with various visions of the way that we think our rights ought to be protected online. So there's a huge role here in an ongoing way for NGOs and journalists who've been doing this accountability work in the past, and government regulators as well, to keep that up in order to continue to improve and ensure that Facebook does fulfill its side of the bargain here, which is to devolve its power in a legitimate way.
Ben, do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I wanted to give Ken Landa a chance to ask his question. Ken, the floor is yours. What's on your mind?
Thanks very much. I was just struggling with the mute button, which seems to be the ordre du jour this season. So thanks very much for welcoming me on. And I appreciated the discussion earlier about a little bit about what's involved in standing up the board and self-organizing and training, et cetera. Timing's interesting. The US election is very rapidly approaching. And I'm wondering to what extent and how the board could be ready to deal with what might well be a pending misinformation and disinformation tsunami. That's a tall order. Am I right in suspecting that a case-by-case court-inspired model can't really mitigate the problem by then? We watch how slowly common law tends to evolve, although there are examples of punctuated equilibrium. So I'm wondering to what extent does the board's timing coincide with global events, and how does the board envision moving forward quickly with the amount of pressure that might be on it?
Great question.
I'm happy to take an initial stab at that. I think there are 2 points that I'd make about this. So one is, and I think this is an important premise that is important to me at least, is that while case-by-case decision-making is one of the hats that the board wears, but it's not the only hat. So the hat also, the board also makes policy recommendations or has the capacity to do so on its own initiative in particular cases. We're going to do an annual report as well, and Facebook can ask us for policy recommendations. And I take that seriously. It's not binding in the same sense in which our individual case decisions will be binding, but it is public and it is transparent, and it is something that Facebook has obligated itself to respond to. So that's a layer of accountability that I think is quite important. We're not the CEO of Facebook. We're not going to control its business decisions, but it does provide a layer of accountability that doesn't ordinarily exist with private companies. But that said, the question is really vital. I think it's on a lot of people's minds, particularly in the United States. And I just think it's important to set expectations at the right level. And I think you're right to be hesitant about what those expectations are. A body set up in the way that this one is not going to resolve all of the burning questions around the US elections. We're going to be hearing our first cases probably not that long before the election. And for me, and I think I speak for certainly a lot of members of the board, this is not a project about the US election. It's a much longer term project. It's a much broader project than that as well, both within the US and around the world. The number of issues that will come to the attention of the board is just dwarfs things that even seem really, really important in the United States. So we're going to try to make sure that we don't let the apparent urgency of the election push us to try to do more than we can. Obviously, we joined the board because we think we want to do something meaningful and impactful, but at the same time, we've got to do the job right, and that's going to take some time to ramp up. So I think it's important not to have that expectation. We're going to approach this thing with as much courage as we can, but also with good judgment.
So the
Sorry,
term
go ahead.
The term punctuated equilibrium reminds me of the dinosaurs, and I think I can affirm that we are not dinosaurs, and we will.
Speak for
I hope
yourself, John.
we will never become dinosaurs. I hope.
I'm pro dinosaur, so I'm not sure I like the anti-dinosaur bias of that remark.
There's always, you might get punctuated. That's the problem with being a dinosaur.
That's true.
As long as I don't get punctured. So I have a question, which is maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but one thing about the a court's independence or an independent entity's independence is that it kind of depends on a certain degree of job security, irrespective of whether the entity likes the results. So Congress and the executive branch don't get to fire the Supreme Court, and that's a key element of the independence. So my question is, how is Ural's independence structured vis-a-vis Facebook, which is, after all, the entity that hired you, the entity that's compensating you, and to the extent that you get reappointed at some point, the entity that reappoints. So what's the what are the protections here against kind of co-optation or regulatory capture on the part of the board?
I will do a very broad overview very quickly of like what the kind of the founding documents say about this, which is just basically that Facebook has said that they will not, like, that a board member cannot be removed for a decision that it makes that they make. They can be removed for code of conduct violations, and the code of conduct is very clear, kind of like what that is. I will say this is actually, I think, one of the more like less well, and I didn't offer I offered almost no advice as I was trying to go through this process and watch Facebook form this. And the one thing that I said was that they needed more rigor around their removal procedures, and they were poorly defined, and then pointed them towards everything from Joey Ito to Nixon's special prosecutor, and no one paid any attention to me.
But well short of removal, there's reappointment, right?
That's totally clear. And you guys can talk about this, but basically, like, there are a bunch of different types, I think, of like independence that you can have. I kind of like go into like a few of them. I had to break them up because I had to think about them in different ways, which is like financial independence, intellectual independence, like kind of all of these various types of independence that you can have, because there was just so much in that one word. Like it's not that there's no clear definition. I would just say that this is the thing that bothers me, I think, to put a finer point on Ben's question, maybe, is, let's say you guys have 3-year terms, and then you're reappointed, and then simultaneous. So that puts us at 6 years. Right? Or if people are reappointed, puts us at 6 years. 6 years is about how long the $130 million grant that Facebook made to the Oversight Board is supposed to last. The question then becomes, in my mind, you have an entire staff of people that depend on the Oversight Board existing. You have for their livelihood, like their jobs. Like, does there become some type of some type of pressure that gets created by like just the existence of all of this, that in some way could like possibly work against like your neutrality towards Facebook if you need a re-up of money in 6 years? I know, sorry. I've had a lot more time to think about these problems, by the way.
So every time I think that the public choice discipline and all of that stuff didn't get taken seriously outside of libertarianism, we have discussions like this, and I realize that we sort of swim in a sea where public choice, I mean, Kate's question just now was a totally, my ex-former colleague and deceased colleague, Bill Niskanen, was all about principal agent problems and all that stuff. And the truth is, in 6 years, I can't say, I don't know what the situation will be. I think we all have some sense of how institutions can go wrong. Part of the stuff we've done is, and we would hope to be alert to those kinds of things. I know I was, during the process when I was just attending workshops, I was quite impressed with how the research staff in various ways had, for example, what I've just talked about, principal agent problems. They really took that seriously and were excited that I asked a question about it, actually. That's the other thing. They had this long answer about it. So I was impressed by that, because those kinds of questions usually get short shrift in these kinds of design issues. I think they worked really hard on thinking about the design of institutions going into this. So I don't know what it's going to be like in 6 years, but I don't think they overlooked some of the issues that all of us should be concerned about.
I'll just weigh in just on, and I want to make sure that the facts are right about the independence of the board. There is a trust. There are trustees. We can't be removed by Facebook. We can be removed by the trustees who are contractually obligated to make decisions independent of Facebook and on the basis of the code of conduct. And that's sort of conflict of interest by those sorts of issues, rather than the decisions. We're not allowed to be removed for the decisions.
Well, specifically also that the trustees are like specifically their duty is to the purpose of the board and
yes.
not to Facebook.
Yes, and so we're not paid by Facebook. We're paid out of this irrevocable trust that was established. So
that's helpful.
The question that Kate asks about, so what happens if if Facebook decides not to fund the trust? Is there some leverage that it has in some sense? I think that that's very difficult to remove, but I think that it's designed as about as well as it could be designed to establish our independence.
One of the things that came. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, and I can only speak for myself, but I would imagine that this is true for everyone else on the board too, that guarantee of independence is fundamental to my decision, at least, and I think everyone else's, to participate. If you think about this, because this is obviously, in academic circles, that this question of influence is incredibly important, and there's been a long history of criticism of and concern about funding for academic research and influence over the things that we do. And I think that we all have a professional commitment to independent judgment here, and we see that as our responsibility. I think that the bylaws and the charter are well established as well as they can be, as Jamal says, to try to guarantee that. But all of us, I think, are personally committed to ensuring that we're not that as far as possible we are able to resist that.
I just want to say really quickly before we go to Sarah, because her question relates to like my follow-up, which is that one of the things when I kind of brought some of these issues up in the course of all of this being of them funding the trust and everything else was one of the things that would come up was like, well, we don't know what's going to happen in 6 years. This is definitely true. I don't know what's going to happen in 60 days, for the love of God. And like right now, like I think that there's but that was like specifically said with this in mind, which was that like maybe other people, maybe other players in industry will invest in the trust and create like a longer term, either create like I have a whole theory about all of the different structures that could eventually play out from this for industry and individual players. But one of the things that was contemplated was like, well, maybe like Twitter will put $100 million into the trust. And then it really becomes a lot less, like it becomes much, and they set up their own oversight board, and like the funds can get invested together or whatever. And this brings us to Sarah's question. Sarah, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, my thinking is that, because Facebook is one of the biggest players in content moderation, there's a possibility of this board structure extending beyond Facebook to other platforms adopting it, or even the whole industry adopting a single centralized board in the form of a Supreme Court of the Internet, as many people have put it. So I'm curious whether you see this happening, and if so, how will this affect how the board will approach content moderation decisions, as well as how each of you individually might approach the board?
Can I have a go at that?
Please.
I think that this is a serious concern, and particularly people like Daphne Keller on your show has raised this this point seriously. I'm not sure that we need to worry about all of the major companies so much here. I think that we will see some diversity. I think at an outset we should say, I do think that other platforms need to be making this sort of investment in some system. I don't know that it needs to be this system. I hope that there is some diversity and experimentation to see, and some competition to see which systems work best at holding tech companies to account. The point I think that Daphne makes really well is that smaller content moderation systems might adopt or fall back on these sorts of determinations if we're making public determinations, because it's cheaper or easier than making the huge investment that's required to set up. And I don't have a good answer to that question, except to say that I think if you look at the culture of a lot of large and small internet platforms, diversity is really key to what they provide, in that we don't want an internet that feels the same everywhere, and that local rule sets and local norms are important to making sure that different platforms serve their particular communities in a way that's useful.
So by personal preference, and not exactly by contract, I cannot be on any radio or video without saying the word Hayek at least once. By that I mean,
I feel really sorry for you. Just get a T-shirt printed, John.
I think it's that at least I like to think that his insights come up all the time, and so I'm a little, what that means in this context: Friedrich Hayek, Constitution of Liberty, lots of other stuff. About the use of knowledge in society, right? I'm a little uncomfortable with a centralizing and having sort of one, and Daphne, actually her comments went to this, I think, after the board was announced. A little uncomfortable with a centralization, that we have one model, that there's a brittleness, there's not a flexibility about it, and that we're not exploring a lot of different options, right? So I like to look at the Reddit model. The Reddit model is very interesting to me. I'm aware of certain problems with it, or certain maybe limits to it. The other thing I would say about the board, though, is we're at the front end of this. It may be the case that what happens here is not that we become the dominant model that everyone adopts, or everyone gets sucked up into the mothership. What may actually happen is we learn things that then are adapted to other contexts and other kinds of social media, or other kinds of activities on the internet. And those things, we have to think, I think at some point we're going to want to think about how those are diffused. And fortunately, there's the public policy literature has some discussions about that, how policy ideas get diffused. So I wouldn't think that we're headed toward one model, and I would sort of want the experimentation process. But the board itself is an experimentation process, and maybe we'll have lessons more than a final model for everyone.
And if I could just add 20 seconds to that. I think that the board is set up to have the capacity to take on other responsibilities or to take on other companies. It's way premature to think that it might do that, or to even know whether it would be a good idea to do that. And so the normative questions that I think Nick and John are both pointing to are ones that not just members of the board, but everyone interested in this will be thinking about and talking about, and hopefully we can learn something, right? And it may not take this form, but hopefully we can contribute to the conversation.
I think I will take my last, or we're going to have to wrap, but I was going to take my last kind of couple of minutes to do two things. One was basically to say that like the trust has like a substantial amount of power, in part because this like kind of industry involvement was imagined to create companies and other types of things. And, we've talked a lot about accountability, but like still like the only direct accountability that users have to the board is through this very limited means of appeal. Like one of the things that I would love to see happen is a way for users to raise issues to the board that they think there should be policy changes on absent appeal, or things that they think that there should be changes in the founding documents on and amendments, or like movements forward in like terms of jurisdiction. And there's nothing precisely like that right now. So I'm just gonna like put that out there as like kind of as one of my thoughts. But the last thing is that, Jamal, I want to invite myself to your Christmas at your house, because you have as far as I can tell, the coolest family that's maybe ever existed, which is like, you are like a Columbia law professor who does like free speech. And then your brother is Talib Kweli. And like, I pretty much think that must make you like your whole like family pretty awesome. And didn't you used to write for ESPN?
Sports Illustrated. So
Sports Illustrated,
which barely exists anymore.
I used to read Rick Riley from like age 8 to 15, like every single issue. And then I realized that the reason I read Rick Riley from ages 8 to 15 was because that's the age he writes for. And it's not that good.
I take the fifth on that.
Yeah. It's like, anyways, it's so great to meet you guys, to see you all again, and to have you here is like kind of to meet the Oversight Board. This has been amazing. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming, guys.
It's been so much fun. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us.
Good. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so Kate, what's our sign off today?
Oh no, I don't have one. I was prepping for this. My sign off is my background. This is a picture that I took while I was at Facebook, that I was like explaining to, like 2 weeks before I'd explained to somebody that like why the Facebook Oversight Board was happening. And someone was like, so it's like basically the Oversight Board is making all of content moderation somebody else's problem. And then I walked through, you can't quite see it because it's in reverse, but then I happened to walk through a building at Facebook, and they had posters all over that said, nothing at Facebook is somebody else's problem. And it just felt like it was like this. Like, it just felt I was like, whoa, are they reading my mind and printing up propaganda before I get here?
I was hoping this was going to be your book cover. That looks great.
I can't. It's like copy. I'm sure it's copy. I'm probably going to get sued for putting it as my Zoom background.
Yeah, well, you're going to end up getting this episode taken down on YouTube again.
Sorry.
But this brings us to the end of another episode of In Lieu of Fun, which is brought to you by us. Anyway.
Just do it, Ben. Just do it. I'm really terrible at that. Just do it, Ben.
No. We're gonna do it. Kate's gonna do it until she nails it. So tomorrow we're gonna have Tim Miller, former Republican street fighter political operative, who is now out in the wilderness, in the world of never Trump pugilism, will be joining us from Oakland, and we've got an amazing week coming up. of which this was just the beginning. So join us tomorrow at 5 Eastern time, 7 a.m. Brisbane, Australia time, Kate. And remember, until then, if you can't have fun, Kate, what can you do?
In lieu of fun, you can still hang out with us.
There you go. She got it.
Sorry,
I've
fucked that up like 8 times in a row. So
thank you all.
Max Weber. Max Weber. Bye, guys.
You know, Max Weber may well have died of the 1918 flu.
We're gonna go. John is gonna start talking about hiking again. We have to go.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks.